It happened in front of everyone. That was the part that made it so hard to forget. Not just what was said, but where. In the middle of a crowded school parking lot on a Friday afternoon, with parents and children everywhere, and nowhere to look away. Thomas was walking toward the school entrance when it happened. He was wearing his work clothes, a faded gray shirt, paint-stained trousers, boots that had seen too many years of hard use. He carried a small paper bag in one hand. Inside it was a birthday cupcake with a single candle, the kind you find in a grocery store bakery, nothing fancy. His son Caleb was turning 7 today, and Thomas had wanted him to have something. That was all. A cupcake. A candle. A father trying. The voice came from behind him. Look at that. Couldn't even get a real cake. Laughter followed. Not a lot of it, just enough. Thomas stopped walking. He turned slowly. The man standing near a large silver SUV was wearing clothes that cost more than Thomas made in a week. He was smiling the kind of smile that isn't really a smile, the kind that holds something mean at the center of it. Thomas looked at him for a moment. Then he turned back around and kept walking toward the school. But something inside him had changed in that moment. Something quiet and permanent. Thomas was a house painter. He had been doing it for 11 years, since he was 26, when the company he worked for closed and painting was the only work he could find quickly enough. He had learned the trade properly. He was good at it. He showed up on time, did clean work, and charged fair prices. It wasn't the life he had planned. But it was an honest one. He lived in a small house on the east side of town with his son Caleb. Caleb's mother, Diana, had passed away 2 years ago, a sudden illness that came fast and left no time to prepare for anything, least of all for raising a 6-year-old boy alone. Thomas had done everything he could to keep Caleb's world stable after that. Same school. Same bedroom. Same Saturday morning cartoons. Same bedtime routine that Diana had started and Thomas continued without changing a single step. He wasn't poor by some definitions. But he wasn't comfortable either. He drove a truck that needed attention. He bought groceries with a rough budget in his head. He fixed things around the house himself because calling someone else cost money he didn't have. He never complained about any of it. What he complained about, quietly, privately, in the space between Caleb falling asleep and his own exhaustion taking over, was being invisible. Being the kind of person that certain other people looked through, as if he occupied a lesser category of human being. He had learned to live with that too. Until today. The man with the silver SUV was named Richard. He lived in the newer part of town, in a house that sat at the end of a long driveway and had a fountain in the front garden that no one had asked for but that everyone was meant to notice. He ran a financial consulting firm. He drove his daughter Isabel to school every morning in the silver SUV and picked her up every afternoon, and he always parked in the drop-off lane slightly longer than he should have. He was not a bad man in every way. He was good to his daughter. He was generous when generosity was visible. He gave to the school fundraiser every year and made sure people knew the amount. But he had a habit. A small, ugly one. He noticed people's worth by their things. By their car, their clothes, their job, the kind of cake they carried into a school. He didn't think of it as cruelty. He thought of it as honesty, as simply seeing the world clearly. He had said the words about the cupcake without thinking much about them. It was the kind of comment he sometimes made, quiet enough to be deniable, loud enough to land. He watched Thomas walk away and felt nothing particular. He adjusted his jacket, took out his phone, and moved on with his afternoon. He had already forgotten it. Thomas had not. Caleb's birthday party was small. 3 friends from his class, a homemade banner that Thomas had painted himself in careful letters, sandwiches cut into triangles, fruit on a tray, and the grocery store cupcake with its single candle. Caleb didn't notice anything missing. He ran around the backyard with his friends, laughing at things that only 7-year-olds find funny. He ate 2 sandwiches and most of the fruit and declared the cupcake the best thing he had ever tasted. Thomas watched him from the back step, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold. He was thinking about the parking lot. About the man's voice. About the laughter. He thought about Diana, about how she would have handled it. She had been better than him at letting things go. She had this way of looking at cruelty and deciding it said more about the person delivering it than the person receiving it, and then simply moving on. He had always admired that in her. He had never quite been able to do it himself. He picked up the cold tea and took a sip and watched Caleb spin in a circle for no reason at all, arms out, head back, laughing at the sky. "You're doing fine," he told himself. He's happy. "You're doing fine." He almost believed it. The following week, Thomas got a call about a job. A large house in the newer part of town needed both interior and exterior painting, a significant project, several weeks of work, good pay. The homeowner had been referred to Thomas by a previous client and had asked for him specifically. Thomas wrote down the address. He drove over that evening to take a look and give a quote. He turned into a long driveway. There was a fountain at the end of it. He sat in his truck for a moment, engine idling, looking at the house. He recognized it immediately. He had not known the man's name or address before. He knew them now. He thought about turning around. He thought about it seriously, about pulling back out of the driveway and driving home and telling the client he wasn't available. It would have been the easier thing. The more comfortable thing. Instead he turned off the engine and got out of the truck. He rang the doorbell. Richard opened the door. There was a half-second, barely visible, where something crossed his face. Recognition. And then something else. Something that might have been discomfort. "Mr. Hartley," Thomas said, reading the name from the referral sheet. "I'm Thomas. I'm here about the paint job." Richard stepped back and held the door open. "Come in," he said. They walked through the house together. Richard pointed out the rooms, the surfaces, what needed doing. Thomas took notes. He asked professional questions, about finish preferences, timelines, whether they wanted the exterior trim to match. He was thorough and calm and gave no indication that anything existed between them except the work. Richard matched his tone. But something was off beneath it, a slight stiffness, a carefulness in how he spoke. As if he was aware of something he didn't want to name directly. At the end of the walkthrough, Thomas gave him an honest quote. Fair price, the same he would give anyone. Richard looked at the number. "That's reasonable," he said. He paused. "Then, you do good work?" "Yes," Thomas said simply. "I do." Richard nodded. They agreed on a start date. Thomas drove home wondering if Richard even remembered the parking lot. Wondering if a moment that had landed so hard on one person had weighed nothing at all on the other. He suspected the second thing. He decided it didn't matter. The work was the work. He would do it well because that was what he did. Whatever Richard thought of him before or during or after, that was Richard's business, not his. He told himself that and mostly believed it. Thomas started on a Monday. He was there at 7:30 with his equipment loaded. He worked steadily and quietly. The house was large but the job was straightforward, and he had done enough of these to move through the work with the kind of ease that only comes from years of practice. Richard left for work each morning and returned in the evening. Sometimes they exchanged brief words. Sometimes not. On the third day, Isabel, Richard's daughter, 9 years old, curious and unguarded in the way children are before they learn to perform, came outside while Thomas was working on the front trim. "What color is that?" she asked, pointing at the paint. "Warm white," Thomas said. "With a little bit of cream in it." "It looks like milk," she said. "It does," he agreed. She watched him work for a while. She asked questions: how do you keep it from dripping, does the brush matter, how long does it take to dry? He answered each one directly, without shortening his answers because she was a child. When she went inside, Richard was standing at the front window. He had been watching. His expression, when Thomas glanced up briefly, was not the expression he had worn in the parking lot. It was quieter. More complicated. The expression of a man beginning to see something he had previously not looked at properly. The moment came on a Thursday afternoon. Thomas was finishing up the last section of exterior work when he heard a car in the driveway, not Richard's SUV, but a smaller car. A woman he didn't recognize got out, looking hurried. She spoke briefly with Richard, who had come to the door, and then both of them looked serious and went back inside quickly. Thomas kept working. 20 minutes later, Richard came outside. He stood near Thomas, not quite beside him, but close enough to be deliberate. "My wife's mother is in the hospital," Richard said. "We have to go. Isabel's coming with us." He paused. "The house will be empty for a few days. You can still come and work, I trust you to be here." Thomas looked at him. The words "I trust you" sat in the air between them. "I'm sorry about your mother-in-law," Thomas said. "I hope she's okay." Richard nodded. He started to turn back toward the house, then stopped. He stood still for a moment. His back was to Thomas. And then he turned around, and on his face was the expression of a man who has been carrying something uncomfortable for a while and has finally decided he can't carry it anymore. "The parking lot," Richard said. "Last Friday. The cupcake." Thomas said nothing. He waited. "That was wrong," Richard said. His voice was plain and direct, not dramatic, not over-explained. Just 3 words that cost him something to say. "It was wrong and I'm sorry." Thomas held the paintbrush at his side. He looked at Richard, really looked at him. At the discomfort on his face. At the effort it had taken to say what he had just said. At the man underneath the SUV and the fountain and the expensive jacket, who was standing in his own driveway admitting to something he didn't have to admit to. Thomas had imagined this moment. Not exactly, but something like it. He had wondered what he would say if it ever came. He had thought of sharp, true things. Deserved things. But standing there, he found he didn't want any of them. "My son loved that cupcake," Thomas said. "He said it was the best thing he'd ever eaten." Richard absorbed that. Something in his face shifted, not quite breaking, but changing shape. "I have a daughter," Richard said. "I would do anything for her." "I know," Thomas said. "I can see that." A pause. "I've been doing this work for 11 years, Thomas said, not with anger but with the simple weight of fact. "I raised my son alone for the last 2 of them. I show up every day and I do the best I can. That's all anyone does." Richard looked at him. He nodded, once, slowly, like a man accepting something real. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm starting to understand that." Thomas finished the job the following week. He did it the same way he always did, thorough, clean, careful. The house looked good when he was done. He was proud of the work in the way he was always proud of work done properly. Richard paid him on the last day. He added something extra, not an enormous amount, but enough to be deliberate. When Thomas noticed it, Richard said simply, "For the quality." Thomas didn't argue. They shook hands at the end. It wasn't a friendship, not yet, and maybe not ever. But it was something. A small shift. 2 men who had looked at each other wrongly and then looked again more carefully. Isabel came outside as Thomas was loading his truck. She studied the finished exterior with serious eyes. "It really does look like milk," she said. "It does," Thomas agreed. She nodded with great authority and went back inside. Thomas drove home in his old truck through the late afternoon light. He picked Caleb up from the neighbor's house where he stayed after school. Caleb talked the whole way home about something that had happened at recess, a story that made no particular sense but that Thomas listened to completely. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He read 2 chapters of Caleb's book at bedtime, doing the voices the way he always did, slightly badly, in the way Caleb loved. After Caleb fell asleep, Thomas sat in the quiet of the kitchen with a cup of tea. He thought about Richard's face when he said "I'm sorry." He thought about how hard that had been. He thought about how easy cruelty is, and how difficult honesty about cruelty can be, and how sometimes people surprise you. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't sure he had ever really been angry, not at Richard specifically. More at the idea of it. The casual ease with which some people erase other people. But Richard had not erased him. Richard had, in the end, seen him. That wasn't nothing. Thomas finished his tea. He rinsed the mug. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. Tomorrow there was another house to paint. Another job done with care, by a man who showed up every single day and did the best he could. That had always been enough. It still was.